I'm going to introduce the next panel discussion, which is titled Remembering the Treason Trial, Alternative Readings for Truth and Reconciliation. As Koyo mentioned this morning, sadly Achille couldn't be here with us today, but this session is moderated by Carolyn Hamilton in conversation with Antjie Krog. I'm going to briefly read both of their bios while the seats come on, and if you'll join me once I'm finished for that conversation. Carolyn Hamilton, trained as a historian, holds a National Research Foundation chair in Archive and Public Culture at the University of Cape Town, and has published widely on the pre-industrial history of South Africa. Her recent work focuses on the limits and possibilities of archives and on operations of power in and through archives. Along with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Hamilton was responsible for the establishment of the archival platform, a civil society-based intervention in the politics of archive and the role of archive in a democracy. She currently hosts the platform at UCT and was previously a member of the board of the South African History Archive and the inaugural council of Robben Island, as well as a founder, member of the Gay and Lesbian Archive. After Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, she had the terrifying honor of being one of his speechwriters. Carolyn Hamilton is National Research Foundation of South Africa Chair in Archive and Public Culture at UCT, as I mentioned. She's joined by Antjie Krog. Krog is a poet, writer, and professor at the University of the Western Cape. She has published 12 volumes of poetry in Afrikaans and 3 non-fiction books in English: Country of My Skull, On the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, A Change of Tongue, about the transformation in South Africa after 10 years, and recently, Begging to be Black, about the different ethical frameworks operating in the country's democracy. In conditional tense, essays on identity after the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Krog uses the commission as a starting point to explore texts from many corners of South Africa in an attempt to remap the borders of our communities. Krog has been awarded most of the prestigious South African awards for non-fiction, translation, and poetry in both Afrikaans and English. International recognition came through the award of the Hiroshima Foundation for Peace and Culture, Open Society Prize from the Central European University, research fellowships, and an honorary doctorate from the Tavistock Clinic of the University of East London, United Kingdom. I want to invite both Carolyn and Antjie to join us on stage. Thank you.
As you know, we are without one of our panelists, and Antjie and I talked a little bit about that, and with the organizers thought we try and draw on the expertise in the room to give us a bigger, thicker, and richer conversation. Because, of course, as you know, we're not the kinds of experts on Kentridge that the former panel were. They're going to have to feed in, Ashraf and Jane, you're going to have to feed in your kind of expertise where ours fails. We'll try our best to give something for the conversation, but we draw on you as well. So I think that's the way we'll proceed. Now, I imagined I might be introducing Antjie, and if I had been introducing her, I think I might have done it very differently. I might have started with the 17-year-old who caused such consternation when she published her first volume. And why I think we need to do that is because the ideas that we have of truth, of course, founded in those very earliest experiences of what is inculcated in us as truth, and then the business of having to spend a lifetime unpicking that. So, Antjie, now over to you. Oh, hang on a second. I want to do one more thing. Do you think we could put up the image that, or have we got it? The image that was the provocation for this, because I'd like to tell you all what the provocation was that we had here. So the provocation that came to this panel was a transcription from the section of the audio guide for the exhibition, where William is speaking about remembering the Treason Trials and what inspired the work. So it goes like this. When Kentridge was 6 years old, in 1961, his father was a lawyer for the defense of Nelson Mandela and 157 others who were accused of treason by the apartheid state. Kentridge tells us more. Every day, my father would go off to Pretoria, where the trial was held. And for me, this is strange, because what could I understand of the treason trial at the age of 3? In the bottom of our garden, excuse me, we had some pine trees, and I thought of these. These are the trees. On our veranda, we had a small table that was covered with mosaics, which we would refer to as the tile table. And in my head, the treason trial became the trees in the garden and the tiles of the table. The treason trial, the treason tile. And I wondered why my father had to go to Pretoria every day if the trees and the tiles are out there in the garden. So what a lot of memories of childhood in the image of this tree and the idea of the picnic we'd go on as a family with the twisted salt and hard-boiled eggs. The picnic and panic, as it's described, and the panic in the country as a whole. Over to Antjie.
Because English is not my thing, I have written it out that I can sound a bit less blunt. It is regularly said that the Truth Commission has failed South Africans. It brought no restitution, not enough truth, and only an immoral kind of reconciliation. And yet, the process of giving testimony produced instances of horror that rendered a person stumm. Any thought that one might have had tumbled down a vortex, leaving one numb. Agreeing with Adorno in a way that to make art out of this would be barbaric. On the 10th of October 1985, Numbulelo Delato was necklaced in Colesberg in the Karoo. During the TRC's second week of hearings into human rights violations, Mrs. Delato's daughter, Busizwe, and Busizwe's aunt, Tomazama Maliti, came to testify. In sparse sentences, no adjectives, no adverbs, no composite sentences, a word here, a phrase there, interspersed with misunderstandings, breakup in languages, translation mistakes, an attempt was made to put words into the silence of that death at the edges. Words drifted like debris around the black hole of that event, and for a few moments the swirling rubble somehow gravitated to form substance, a minute glimpse into the darkness, rescuing an image of an abandoned woman in flames. I just want to play a 2-minute clip from that testimony. This is the aunt testifying, and the daughter has not grasped what has happened to her mother.
He went to hide in another house, and they took him out of that house. They took his overall, and they poured him with petrol bomb. One of them held his feet, and then they started igniting her feet. They were beating him up. I'm sorry, I can't hear. The microphone is off. They beat her up, and they put a tire on her. There was nobody who could stop this. Our offense was because we were related to this policeman, Fezil, our uncle.
pick up.
I ran to Cape Town.
In this context of art and genius here today, my question is, what do we do about what had happened and is still happening on the edges? The predicament of an artist is that she feels ethically driven to respond to this. But she hesitates. She feels herself simultaneously barred by her own ethical impulse, but also by a whole phalanx of legitimate cries, "Stay out of our story." Myself and Sindiwe Magona was once berated by South Africa's most talented photographer. "What are you two doing in your art about the killing of lesbians in the township?" This is the quandary artists face and have to face of historical positionality and action. 2. Of course, Kentridge has lived intimately with our dire politics since a very young age. He could legitimately have made his family's sacrifices or his own engagement as a student part of his personal expression of victimhood and clean hands. He didn't. He preferred to develop a visual language in which he could engage politically as both artist and complicit white. And I would like, in a way, for us to interrogate whiteness and Jewishness, because in a way, Jewishness has the label that it's the blacks of the world or the blacks of Europe. So if a Jewish man is being put opposite a black man, is it two of the similar people, or is it within a South African context, white and black? Treading very carefully not to appropriate a black presence, nor stereotyping it, he explored other routes to explore political themes. For example, the tree series, the Johannesburg landscape, so Eckstein and Felix Teitelbaum. In terms of the TRC, Kentridge engaged with material from the TRC while the commission was still in session. So Ubu and the Truth Commission was first performed in 1997, a year before the final report was handed to Nelson Mandela. The TRC idea of unearthing the past and rethinking it had a later incarnation in Kentridge's Transvaal series 2013, especially in the work Making the Tree Search. That is the title of the lithograph. Below the tree in this lithograph are small cameo bushes with official-looking headlines, "Disinter, Reconfigure," and elsewhere, "Bodies in the Veld, My Country's Grave." So instead of the TRC searching for truth, the tree is made to search. And here, among the branches used twice, is indeed the phrase, "remembering the Treason Trial." So the tree, the family tree perhaps, growing from the very soil filled with graves, is being made to search. To deal with the predicament of historical positionality and action, I want a small detour through the work of another important artist absorbed with ethical action, John Coetzee. Although Coetzee was accused for not being politically as brave as Nadine Gordimer, for example, I find his penetrating thinking about how to respond as an artist amidst so many contradictory ethical pressures very valuable. Agonizing about voicing a character, Coetzee writes in his diary that there is, and I quote, "an bridgeable gap, and then bracket, and must be so with all comfortable liberal whites. Close bracket. And the best one can do is not to leave it out, but to represent it as a gap. In other words, the reader has to be reminded in the text itself of that gap. That the writer is aware that this is a representation also of the gap. An insecure effort to imagine the impossible. In other words, the very hesitation felt by the artist, the knowledge of the failing, should itself become part of the artwork. So it's not only inside yourself where it could or should be, but it's also in the work. The reader must be always aware of your awareness that you are representing and that you are failing. I want to look now at remembering the Treason Trial. One of the most well-known images of the Treason Trial is a photograph of all the trialists, of different ethnicities, backgrounds, histories, languages, religions, dreams, and ideals brought together by their courageous stance against injustice. One can say a tree of people, a tree rooted in their sense of justice, an encyclopedia of justice within the tree. Rusty Bernstein wrote about that trial. Interracial trust and cooperation is a different plant to cultivate in the poisoned soil outside. It is somewhat easier in here, where the leaders of all ethnic factions of the movement are together and explore each other's doubts and reservations and speak about them without constraint. But the concept of a tree is also being used in graphs. You know, when you scientifically give graphs, this was related to and this is the organizational structure, etc. Scientific data are presented in tree format, but in a non-linear structure. The tree graph stores and organizes data hierarchically. So a tree becomes a collection of entities called nodes, and every node has a value. So the tree in this lithograph, as well as its surroundings, are interspersed with non-linear language scrapings, fonts, gleanings, clippings, as if these linguistic phrases are nodes containing their own value and data. And what are these? Mainly a litany of whilst. Whilst waiting to reply, whilst looking at him from the side, whilst peeling the egg, whilst waiting for his father to come home. The nodes contain information about ordinary daily actions, as if suggesting that this tree of trialist courage was rising from the South African landscape at the same time that many mundane things were happening. Perhaps not only mundane, but unforgivingly unaware and unsupportive of this important process happening among ourselves. At the same time, looking at the tree, one's throat constricts at its rather slender, albeit tough-looking trunk, its somewhat disjointed branches, its sparse foliage, its haunting suggestion that inside a major event, small, everyday, humble actions by ordinary people also take place. This is not a mighty tree. It's neither luscious nor triumphantly impressive. It doesn't carry the overwhelming strength such a crucial 5-year international news-making and history-changing event ought to have had in our landscape. And when you begin to think this, the whole mental image of this tree unravels. It moves now from frail to perhaps inappropriate. At this, you have arrived at the moment of Coetzee's unbridgeable gap. You are destabilized. The artist has made you aware of the how he is approaching the impossible. And the how, of course, started with a bad splaying Chinese brush, which couldn't be controlled. This is the first how. The second how is the carving of these drawings into linoleum plates by a team. Everyone, of course, bringing their own character to it. The third how is the printing of these engravings on 63 pages from a textbook of Rand metallurgical practice. The tree exists on a spread of individual made from wood pages done in ink that bores into the main and most deliberate exploitation of black life in this country. On the page marked D9, under the heading Mine Development, we see that the white wages are £18,000, native wages £8,000. The mine worked with highly poisonous cyanide, first used on the Rand in 1890, but this led to such a boom of investment that larger gold mines opened. For working with cyanide, white wages were £2,184 and native wages were £428. And so this treason trial tree shakily raises its stressed trunk and foliage within a context of mining, money, and exploitation, while at the same time being blessed and contaminated by texts of non-involvement. Now for a fourth how. As if its fragility is not enough, the whole visual image comes to us broken up in small unhinged pages, mounted onto another larger page, framed, somehow reminding us as well as countering the iron grills set up during the treason trial to separate whites from the others, and then another grill to separate women from men, and then another grill to separate white women from black women, etc. It feels as if everything can come loose in this artwork at any moment, and gone would be the effort to remember all the knowledge, all the sacrifice, all the dreams that a handful of South Africans once had for a humane society. And this is what moves me, that the treason trial is not sidestepped, but presented. Second, that it is presented with hesitation, with the knowledge of all the destabilizing consequences of an ethical imperative. I'm moved by the frighteningly unstable, stumbling presentation, as if the treason trial is already nearly nothing, as if we have already lost what we should have contained. And yet, something in this tree, in its slender resilience, talks to us about what art at its best does, calling us into a clearing of truth about what it means to be humane.
Thank you, Antjie. I think we have added to the provocation that the work put forward and with Antjie's words. So it would be really peculiar, I think, for me to sit here and offer a question to Antjie and ask for an answer and then have another question and even to just have a two-person conversation. So I'm going to say a few things, and then if I can possibly see you through the spotlights, I'm going to rely on you to wave perhaps frantically when you're ready to enter the conversation. Don't leave it too long, because we, the two panelists, depend on you. So the first question or the first point that I want to make is that, of course, the tree grows through time, and I think in other works we've there are allusions to the way in which the tree captures the sediments from the world that it grows through, and in fact constantly carries the mark of the time of its growth. You can think about the tree rings and how much reading is possible about drought and growth and possibility of every aspect of the evidence or the mark or the trace that the tree is that grows through time. So that raises, I think, for us, the question of the archive that is available, the archive that's not available, that which can't be remembered, that which must be conjured, and a million other possibilities of archive. So I think we want to have the nature of what the Kentridge works do to the concept of archive, the stable archive and the unstable or the destabilized archive, as part of what we want to talk about, and the notion of truth. If we go to the matter of trial, the trial, I think, raises immediately the question of, I'm trying to think of the phrase from the previous session, I think it was you and the other citizen, which is part of what Antjie's referring to when she says there's this gap that has to be navigated. Now, I think the incredible complexity of the whole of the body of work of Kentridge endlessly circles this matter of you and the other citizen, multiple other citizens. So I think that's a question that maybe we want to draw much more discussion on. So the one point that I'd like you to think about is, what about other citizens other than imagining this discussion as constrained by a white person engaging in a world where blackness is always the other? Because surely the possibilities of the multiple other citizens are so endless and put such ethical responsibility on us that when we reduce it only to the one, then perhaps we're not standing forth to take the responsibility that I think we're required to take. I don't know if that's a comment or a question.
No, I mean, people talk about the white gaze, but I feel in this country we are experiencing, or I do, the black gaze in a quite a different way, etc. All of that, but there is a way in which you are aware that the main thinking is done by black people, and you are under observation. I want to, Coetzee has this wonderful phrase in Age of Iron where he uses Socrates, who said, if an unexamined life is not worth living. And then Mrs. Curran says, if I have an examined life, it's because it is under the examination of Florence. I am in the court of black people. So in that sense, I find it difficult to bring that into one's artistic space. How do you deal with that? How do you give account of that? Because I have read literature, international literature, before I covered the Truth Commission. I was horrified by what I learned there. It was as if the depth, as if the width, as if what was done. And I was thinking, why hadn't art taught me better? Why wasn't I in ways prepared for what I was seeing here? Maybe it's not the job of art. I'm not, we hear now different things of what art should do. But are we also then not failing if we don't grasp the depth of what is happening? Anyway,
So
I want to say to William, I admire you that you sit here and listen. It would horrify me to listen to all of this. Because in a way, academic thinking is always from the outside. It is always ask you questions that you haven't thought about, and those that you were busy engaging with what you... There's another IQ inside yourself that is engaging with what you try to say. And after such an academic discussion, I always feel like I'm wrapped in cobwebs or in a straitjacket, or that I battle to find a space where... But good, I salute you that you have the know and that you find it interesting.
And I don't think you have to wait to the end to chip in. So I see that Primesh has signaled first.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. So it's a very brief question. I'm struck by the comment about the failure of the TRC. Because in my reckoning, I think the TRC has been entirely successful.
Yes.
In fact, it's structured all our discourses. I mean, I'm doing interviews for a documentary film now, and everybody speaks to you as if they're at the TRC. In fact, it's organized all of our aesthetic sensibilities, and it's organized some of those sensibilities in very constraining ways. And so I'm wondering whether, in some sense, we're stuck with an impossible machine, that the TRC, in some sense, to quote Adam Zeitz, was an impossible machine to begin with, that it was an impossible feature of producing a desire for the post-apartheid. And I'm wondering whether one might want to turn the tide on the TRC and think about it in the way in which it seeped into almost every facet of our life. I mean, there's a way in which the political discourse of this country is entirely structured by the TRC, and whether in some sense it's time to think ahead.
While it was happening, I myself was, and the word that we used most often is that it couldn't be, you couldn't have anticipated this. It was all the time breaking everything that everyone thought would happen. But the academics, again, wrote for years after the Truth Commission. Every single academic book about the Truth Commission is about its failure, how it failed this, how it failed that. But because, in a way, it was so successful, it now gets blamed for everything that went wrong. They didn't ask for the land issue to be resolved. The Truth Commission didn't bring reconciliation. The Truth Commission didn't bring truth. Yes, people still looking for truth. So because it was so successful, I think it's like Mandela. Because he was so successful, it remains the place where we put all our blame for, instead of taking it for us, to ourselves. Now, I also think it was amazingly successful, except in one way, I would say, and that's that we didn't think properly what we want out of it. I mean, the reason for the Truth Commission was to give amnesty. That was the clause that was written into the interim constitution. Amnesty shall be given because through a process. So through the lens of forgiving, etc., you will give amnesty. But in the end, we wanted truth, we wanted forgiveness, we want the land issue to be dealt with, we want race to be... and I'm always thinking, if we said we will use the Truth Commission in order to restitute, to give the land back, or you ask money or extra tax, so people would have been more willing to share than now. I mean, now no one is, yeah.
And if I can just add to that, the session couples the Treason Trial and the TRC inevitably. But what of other trials which set in place discourses that we lived with in the face of tremendous catastrophes? I mean, you could think of endless ones. I could think here of the 1906 trial of the so-called Bambata Rebellion, in which let's call it indigenous discourse, if you like, the indigenous discourse of what rulership meant came under the attack of the colonial states seeking to establish what is law and what is not law. And that discourse by 1910 had become the discourse of tribe and was outside of political life. And we could go on. We could go back to the Cat River settlement or many such cases. So we want to watch these possibilities of other discourses which became dominant and then got pushed out, and how that has happened. Koyo, I think you wanted to come in. Am I seeing correctly?
It's
no.
Saki. I wanted to refer to what Antjie said in the speech, the frailty of the mental image of the tree, and how it can be applied in a universal notion. And for me, before I explored this image further, I was reminded of the lynchings that occurred in the United States of America, and specifically a song by Billie Holiday that was later sung by Nina Simone called Strange Fruit. And a line in there says that black bodies swinging in the summer breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. So going back to a tree being something that could be used for scientific knowledge, to map out knowledge, and knowing how there's a history of the racist epistemology of science as it applied to blackness through phrenology. And this tree is interesting in that you don't see the objectification of black bodies. Rather, like you called it, a tree of justice or trialist courage, you're seeing these texts which are based whilst, and this whilst I've heard William say comes from the ledgers and reports from mines. When people are killed or involved in an accident, they have to report what that worker was doing during the time of the accident. So they say whilst he was walking, he was hit over by a truck or whatever. So here we have the whilst being applied to whiteness and not the bodies being reduced of black people to labor and machinery. But what about white ignorance that occurred during a time when people who wanted the Freedom Charter, because we also have to remember the reason why the trialists were arrested and detained. It was because they created the Freedom Charter, and the Freedom Charter speaks about the redistribution of wealth. And so that's when you achieve economic freedom. So this in turn kind of subverts that racial history of science being used to objectify and subject the black body to study.
No, thank you. No, I think it's exactly doing that. It's saying that while people were living their white lives, but the background is saying this is what actually happened. I mean, it's all in there. I want to just refer to Germany because they found it so hard to deal with the Second World War past. And nothing could be done, and everyone was too scared to deal with it. Someone in Berlin said to me, but then Hollywood came and took our history and made films out of it, and then made our history or abused our history. So one actually should be thankful that our past is being dealt with in so consistently and so sophisticatedly. Because the Truth Commission itself, it didn't deliver much documentaries. The French made documentaries, the Germans made, the Dutch made, the Japanese made. There were several documentaries made by other countries. There were hardly anything. It was Max de Prieur on TV. There's one or two films that I know about that has direct link to the TRC. but it is if we all, in ways, avoid it, to deal with the material.
A hand waving at the back. Who's it referring to? To William, right?
Yes. It's a very awkward situation to be part or not part of the discussion, but I do want to respond to some of the things.
You're part of it.
Okay. Some of the things from Antjie. Is it all right? Must I come to the front, or is it all right there? The back here, it's all right. Okay. There are so many things to be said about trees and about the metaphors that trees embody inside of us to talk about the making of the Treason Trial. But one of the things, and I'll talk about this element more in the talk tonight, and it's obviously one of the lines between what it is to analyze a work after it's made, or to respond to a work after it's made, and to be making it. I was making an image of a tree, and there were lots of phrases and pieces of text. I knew it was going to have text in it. One of the texts was a text called saying, "Remembering the Treason Trial." And it was placed in different places in the tree. At first, the picture was called Panic Picnic, and then those were shifted down. I wanted to put them at the bottom, and somehow that text ended on the top left-hand corner, "Remembering the Treason Trial." And then when the picture was finished, I thought, well, usually the title of the piece comes from the top left corner, the text there, and that became the text. And so once the piece was finished, all this cascade of meanings start to flow into it. But it's such a dumb process compared to what it ends up as that I want to kind of stress. So all the things you say about the nature of the tree and the mark are all completely right, but they're things that are there rather than things that are planned or considered. Which is very different to your question about the artist's responsibility or the response of artists. You're saying, in the face of these terrible things that we see or we know about, what is it that the artist does? And you refer correctly to Zanele Moholi, who in some ways in our current times embodies so well the mixture of an activist and an artist. Although for me her most interesting work is the work she does of self-portraiture, which is somewhat different from the activist series of photos that she's made. But when I started out, after some years of thinking myself as artist-activist, thinking in a Leninist way, what are the images that one needs to make to change the world, I became completely stuck and had to abandon the activity of making art, because I could see no way of both being able to answer that question and make work that felt true to the uncertainty and the ambiguity of actually making art, and what that process showed of the world. So when I came back to it, was with the idea very much that the only thing I could offer was what happens in the studio, and that to see what emerges from the studio, and obviously that's connected to what happens in the world, but it doesn't start, it could not start with an agenda of, even the agenda of what is the responsibility of the artist, what is the responsible thing to be doing. To actually do the work in the studio, it had needed a less, I suppose, a less ethical origin. It had to accept its complicity, its mess, its uncertainty, its all the other parts that go into what it is to spend those years in the studio. And when we came to the TRC, this was again halfway between. On the one hand, there was remarkable material, and you helped us when we made the play, Ubu and the Truth Commission, and Jane Taylor, who was talking earlier today, was the author of the text we used. And it was a balance between what is our responsibility to the testimony such as we heard, such as we saw on the screen at the beginning, and what is it that emerges. And here I would place us back to what you said at the beginning about the gap. The awareness of the gap between what is being represented in the world that is being represented, that you referred to in John Coetzee's writing. And even in the Truth Commission, even within the image that we saw on the screen, one is so aware of the gap in that actual event, in the process, that it was a theatrical process, that there's the gap between the pain of someone giving testimony and the translator. Was the translator meant to, was the most authentic thing to copy the tears of the person giving evidence, or to be neutral. There were a series of bad, there was no good solution. There were only a series of less good or less imperfect solutions. And when we came to make the play, it was the idea we would take the most burlesque, the most absurd, the grotesquerie of Alfred Jarry's Ubu, and place this up against the most straight repeating of testimony from the TRC, and saw what these two things did against each other. And one of them, I think, is to make that gap very apparent. You know you're looking at a grotesque cartoon, but does that stop you hearing the testimony, or in a strange way does that make you more aware of what you are listening, which was, of course, the proposition we had in doing the piece. And I think in many countries they've said that the only way to progress, particularly after civil wars, is for there to be a general amnesia rather than an amnesty. So in Spain, they couldn't speak about the Spanish Civil War until about 5 years ago. In France, it took 40 years or 50 years after the end of the Second World War to start talking about collaborators. Before that, it was all just this myth of everyone being a resistance fighter. And I think, you know, it was one of the things that we did take on, and for me it's enormously to our national credit that this task of remembering and of pointing out and showing and recovering the events that had happened so directly. Because otherwise we would have been lost in a world where still we would have so many people saying we didn't know what has happened, we had no idea. Whereas one thing the TRC did, even if there were gaps, and we know there were enormous gaps, was to make that painful history, that shameful history, part of a consciousness for everyone in the country. And all the ethical conundrums of the TRC, the fact that it was always a Faustian pact, a pact with the devil, that yes, we will tell you the terrible things that were done, and in return you'll give us amnesty and no one will have to take responsibility, has left us with an ethics of the country where no one feels they have to take responsibility for any actions done, because if those terrible actions could be forgiven, why can't lesser crimes, stealing a few million or billion here and there, why shouldn't they be forgiven as well? So we're certainly living with the consequences of that first decision. But in terms of the tree, I sort of feel very happy on behalf of the image for the generous reading that you've given to it. And I feel the person who made it doesn't really deserve that credit, but we'll take it all the same. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Antjie and Carolyn. I've been sitting here through this session particularly and looking at this tree and listening to all of you, knowing Antjie's work about Truth and Reconciliation Commission and my very little knowledge about South Africa. You have to apologize. I mean, you have to excuse me. But I cannot not think about the symbolic of the rootedness and the symbolic of the location in terms of a tree, and also the symbolic of the rhizomatic, the idea of the messiness, and the idea of the interdependency, and the idea also, to some extent, kind of collective participation. And I think that when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up in the 90s, many of us on the continent, outside of South Africa, were extremely, I mean, I remember conversations with friends and colleagues and family where we were extremely impressed by the, how do you say it, the rapidity, I mean, how fast it came about, and extremely, for my part personally, I was very careful and cautious, wondering where will this lead, particularly because I was concerned, and I'm still concerned today, with what do we do with anger. And And what do we do with resentment, rightly so? And where is that place that one can deal with that? And I was a little bit, how do you say, kind of worried about how fast the idea of amnesty came about in a context that suffered, I think, one of the most dehumanizing social systems that we know. So I wonder how, if we go back to the tree and go back to the artist, and looking at William's entire work, where he also, as an artist, stays away from judgment, stays away from taking position about that anger, and tries to translate or represent and show everything else around it, such as, for me, at the end of the day, still positing that anger at the center. So my question to you, Antjie, is you started earlier by saying that we are living under the, but you located it in South Africa, that we are living under the black gaze. I want to understand what that means from your perspective.
I feel I'm being judged. My past is being judged. My language is being judged. What it has brought, what it has destroyed. I feel I'm being looked at with everything that I still have. I feel I am seen as privileged, and it doesn't matter what is that privilege is erasable. It's generations of privilege. And if you work with students who don't have that, it's the insecurity of just your complete self. I don't have that. And it's generations of confidence and generations of education that brings one to certain assumptions. So I feel I'm walking in a storm of anger. And guilt is there, but guilt is for me not an adequate word. Privilege is also not an adequate word. It's a complete imbalance. And one way you think, I have to give account of that as an artist. And then I think the fact that I'm an artist is already part of the privilege. I mean, I could write at 17 something because I had access to my mother's library. I had a school, I was in a language that published poems by a 17-year-old. So I have a publisher, I have a translator. You know, it's all indulgences in that, and I don't know how to. My kind of language is a kind of old Afrikaans language with its nuances and its idiomatic places where it was killed from. Yeah, so on the one hand you feel, I just have to live through this. Not through this. I have to live with this until the end. And then you think, no, you must do something. You must do something. And then you think, but what should you do? Black people should tell you what to do. We don't want you in this land. We want you to fuck off, go away. Then we can say, hey man, I'm going to stay here, you know, live with it. Or, no, you know what, if you don't want me here, I will leave. Or, we want your things, but we don't want you. I'm waiting for that deadline that says, this is what we want. Now you either do it or you leave. No, it's this thing that, anyway.
I just want to, just very quickly, I mean, I think that's why it is much more interesting from my perspective to speak about the rhizomatic or the messiness and the anger as opposed to the guilt, because I think that there is a shared anger. I mean, I hear a lot of anger in your response. So there is not like an anger on one side and there is none on the other side. I think that shared space of anger, I think, can be quite fruitful.
Hi. Maybe some comments and some questions, I'm not sure. So the sister over there started to ask some of my questions, which is what is the scrutiny, what is the gaze, and then I guess you started to answer some of it. When did it start? So this is something that I'm interested in. When did you begin to feel insecure in this country? As a white person, so there's something about it being generational, yeah? But the way that you are experiencing yourself now, 30 years ago, even the fact that your students now are black students, etc. So, like, when did it start, right? And then marking that critical moment of when it started, what does it mean? What do you think that the gaze is asking of you, right? Which is something you began to answer. You're waiting for the deadline. Sister, there's a deadline. People are telling you all the time. It's just people are selectively listening. And it's very nice, this intellectual exercise over here, but I imagine maybe some of us are on the ground in this country, maybe even you, yeah? There are things that people are needing of you, that people are asking of you, that people are wanting of you, and sometimes it gets it becomes very disappointing when the intellectual exercise is to, what do the blacks want me to do? Says, you know. You know, okay. And then I was thinking as well, this group, I'm staying, you know, that's a response to something, you know? Land grabs, constantly. Like, wow, there are people living on the street in Observatory because they get kicked out by the gentrifiers. Like, there were people who were asking, you know, for donations of tents. What can you do? Imagine these ridiculous questions. Okay, so another thing. Oh, I like this thing of complicity. I think it's really interesting, and even looking at myself, like as somebody who went to particular kinds of schools, who speaks like this, who can arrive here, etc. And then somebody who's also determined to stay on the ground, to make sure that like my community and my collective is not here, okay, but it's the people, like the masses of our people who we are also part of, who have been in the struggle through the TRC, right? And if the TRC serviced 5 people, there are 500, okay? Sorry, so much anger. I am so angry today. And I'm sorry to bring it around again. This is about complicity again. I'm angry at you, Ashraf. I'm very angry at you. Because for me, to not think that looking at things through what you are calling binaries, whether it's a gender or it's a class or it's a race, these things that you think are boring. For me, to not consider that those are in themselves nuanced frames, especially if you are looking through your own complicity and through the intersections of your complicity, and to understand that, yes, okay, there is this kind of, oh, the universality, oh my God, humanness, and yum, 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 yum. But we are living in a history which has polarized us, right? We are living in a present history which is polarizing us, that us sitting in this room are in polarity to others on the ground elsewhere. And that sometimes, Ashraf, because you say fucking fantastic things, and then you say these hurtful things, and I don't understand why you want to dismiss these very real experiences of people who themselves are also trying to look at their complicity. Why you refuse to look at your own. Here's Antjie, the white mother, looking at her own complicity, and you're saying it's childish. You're saying it's childish of black people. It is so painful, brother. Like, Okay. Because for me, to be honest, when we speak about complicity, and we are really trying to grapple with ourselves, and that yes, we are human, and that we are trying to become more human, and that it is a beautiful exercise, but that we are black humans, we are white humans, we are women humans, we are trans humans, we are femmes, we are queers, we are a lot of things. We are poor people, we are teachers, we are students, and this is the maelstrom that makes up the world, that makes up the fucked up shit place we have all co-created together. And then to go from this, looking at our own complicities and gently trying to gentle each other back towards the community, I think that this is a beautiful exercise and worthy of taking on.